Welcome back to Mystery Files. We are in Hell Month, and this is story number 5. So, this one today, really special. I've had one of these before. I might put it up right now, or I'll leave it in the description. But this is one of those ones that could be a movie, and that hopefully will turn into a movie. But this one, like I said, is very special. But what you have to do is try your hardest from the gods or whoever you preach to gather that strength and to get this video to at least 55 likes. We haven't been able to do it yet. We've got to 50 and we're getting close. 55 likes. And please don't forget, there will be a hidden clue in today's story. So find what it is and put what it is along with the timestamp in the comments to get entered into the giveaway. Okay, so without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. Dale Merle Nelson was a tortured soul, his inner demons brewing beneath the surface of his seemingly normal life. Living in Creston, British Columbia, he worked hard as a logger and hunted deer for sport on the side. But at home, he was anything but successful. Imprisoned and consumed by despair, alcohol became his solace, and LSD was his escape. I mean, he had a family to support, 3 children that looked up to him. Yet his drinking binges would leave them abandoned, confused, and scared. And his good moments with them would be few and far between, and only when he was sober. And in the early 1970s, a deadly combination of emotions pushed him to try to take his own life. Thankfully, he made it through alive and spent 2 months at Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam. Upon his release, the town of Creston was not prepared for what would happen next. Friday, September 4th, 1970, started out as an ordinary day in the life of Dale Nelson. He wasn't working that day, and so he drove into Creston. He purchased a 6-pack of beer and a bottle of vodka, and then proceeded to the Kootenay Hotel bar, where he hooked up with some of his hunting buddies. And he appeared in high spirits. Those buddies would later recall talking enthusiastically about the upcoming season. He also downed 8 beers in a couple of hours, but that was hardly unusual for Dale. He was walking straight and true when he left the tavern. But Nelson's next stop was the home of a friend, Maureen Mcgee, and he'd recently loaned Maureen his 7mm Mauser 98K rifle and wanted to know if he could have it back for a few days. He said, "I'm going hunting tomorrow," as he explained to Maureen, and Maureen, of course, returned the weapon. Nelson then drove back into town and bought several boxes of ammunition for the Mauser before convening to the King George Hotel to continue his boozing spree. He would remain there until 10:30 p.m. when the bar closed. But Nelson's friends had rented a room in the hotel and it was stocked with liquor. So Nelson would join them there for another hour and a half, drinking himself into a stupor. And when he eventually departed, it was just after midnight. A few minutes after leaving King George Hotel, Dale Nelson pulled his truck to a stop outside the home of Shirley Wasik, shared with her husband Alex and their 3 daughters, Debbie, who was 12, Charlene, who was 8, and Tracy, who was only age 7. Shirley Wasik was a distant relative of Nelson's, but the two of them were not exactly close, so it's uncertain why he chose this particular house. Perhaps it was because he knew that Alex Wasik was out of town, so Shirley and her daughters were unprotected. In any case, Nelson walked right onto the porch and tried the front door. And as he goes, he finds that it's unlocked. So he enters, and then standing in the dark for a moment before he saw a light go on down the hall and heard footsteps approaching, rooting around in the darkness, his hand brushed against something smooth. So he lifted up the object, appreciating its weight, and Shirley Wasik was surprised to find Dale Nelson standing in her living room in the middle of the night, and surprised to see that he was holding the home fire extinguisher.
Dale?
She started to say that, and that's all she got out, because Nelson swung the extinguisher and knocked her out cold with one single blow. He then dragged her into the bedroom and laid her out on the bed before binding her hands and feet using items from her underwear drawer. With that done, he proceeded to the bedroom that 8-year-old Charlene shared with 7-year-old sister Tracy. Now, while all of this was going on, the eldest of the Wasiak siblings, 12-year-old Debbie, had been woken up from her sleep. So as she creeped out her bedroom door, she peered out into the hall just in time to see a man entering her sister's room. And of course, Debbie's first instinct was to alert her mother. So she waited until the man was out of sight, and then she tiptoed down the passage into the master bedroom. There, she was shocked to find her mom tied up on the bed, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. She kind of tried to prod her mother awake, but when that didn't work, she loosened her hands and feet and tried to lift her from the bed. And it was at that moment that Debbie heard a blood-curdling scream coming from her sister's bedroom. That was when she knew that she had to go for help. Using the fire extinguisher, she smashed the window and then climbed through, escaping the room just as an ominous figure approached the doorway. From there, she was sprinting, running hard for her neighbor's house, Maureen Mcgee, the same Maureen Mcgee who had returned Dale Nelson's borrowed rifle earlier that day. Listened to the little girl in her frantic story and then called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So RCMP officers arrived soon after, and they walked in. One of the bloodiest crime scenes any of them have ever attended. Shirley Wasik was dead. Her skull was beaten to a bloody pulp with a fire extinguisher. Even worse was to be found in the little girl's bedroom. 7-year-old Tracy had been literally torn apart. Her abdomen ripped open from her neck to her legs, and her innards were exposed. And even more sickening was evidence that the killer had chewed on Tracy's intestines and then bolted down flesh and the half-ingested remnants of the child's last meal. And as if that was not enough, Nelson had also mutilated the little girl's face, slicing from the corners of her mouth to her ears, leaving a grotesque grin. And given these horrible mutilations inflicted on Tracy, the police did not hold out much hope for finding her sister Charlene alive. The 8-year-old was missing from the house, and there were genuine fears that Nelson had carried her away to do her whatever his sick mind wanted to conjure and do. And if he'd done so, it must have been on foot, since he had left his truck behind at the scene. That at least meant that he couldn't have got far. But time was of the essence, and the officers quickly organized themselves into a search party. Sorry guys, I forgot to mention, but this story is extremely explicit, and it's extremely hard for me to tell, so just bear with me. And the police were just about to enter the woods when Charlene emerged. Severely traumatized, but physically unscathed. Somehow, she'd managed to escape the killer. But there were others in danger from Dale Nelson, most specifically his own family. And that's when me, Mr. E-Files, didn't really feel like doing this bit on such a serious story, but he said, listen guys, that could be a diversion. You might not want to leave his truck. That's all I'm gonna say. They looked at me and they said, you're just a kid. You have no idea what you're talking about. We're the real pros. We're the police officers. Let us do our job. I said, okay, but you know, I will be telling the story in the future years, and if you mess this moment up, it could indeed affect more lives. With this in mind, officers scrambled for their vehicles and raced for the Nelson residence, where they woke up a startled Annette Nelson from sleeping and told her to round up the boys. They were being placed in protective custody, but unfortunately, the Mounties had failed to secure the crime scene. By the time they returned to the Wasiak residence 15 minutes later, Nelson's truck was gone. So too was the body of Tracy. Astonishingly, the killer had returned to the scene to steal the corpse of his victim. Nelson didn't go far, just a few miles down the road to where Isabel St Amand lived, with her common-law husband Ray Phipps, and their 4 children, Paul, who was 10, Kathy, who was 8, Brian, who was 7, and Roy, who was just 8 months old. So Ray Phipps answered a knock at the door in the middle of the night to be confronted by a man with a gun, and he was shot and killed right where he stood. Nelson, the killer, then entered the residence, spraying death as he walked. Isabel was shot to death while trying to protect her children. Then Paul and Brian and even the baby Roy were shot, all of them suffering head wounds from a powerful hunting rifle that absolutely obliterated their features. The only one that was spared was 8-year-old Kathy. Her fate, however, was even worse than that of her brothers. She was whisked off into the night by the killer. So as of now, a massive manhunt was now underway, with a large contingent of police scouring the rugged woodland, and brush pilots employed by local logging concerns provided support from the air. And by late afternoon, they had gotten their first break, because Nelson's truck was found stuck in a ditch near West Creston. Several liquor bottles littered the ground in the vicinity, and the police also found a bloody hammer, clotted with human hair in the cab of the truck. That, however, was nothing compared to the gruesome markers Nelson had left behind. Tracy Wasik's dismembered remains were found scattered all throughout the area. Not to mention that Nelson had decapitated her corpse, hacked off her arms and legs, ripped open her ribcage. In the wake of this latest atrocity, the authorities took the extraordinary step of evacuating the entire town of West Creston, moving all 150 residents for their own safety. But they would not have to remain in exile for long. Nelson was finally run to the ground on the afternoon of Sunday, September 6th. He was found hiding in a shack in the woods near his home. He surrendered without a fight and almost immediately admitted his guilt. Later that day, he would lead officers to the tiny corpse of 8-year-old Kathy St Amand. Nelson had held the terrified little girl captive overnight, periodically sodomizing her before eventually stabbing her to death. He also could not resist tearing open the child's abdomen and exposing her insides. Given the horrific nature of this killing spree, it is tempting to conclude that Dale Nelson must have been incurably insane. Indeed, this was what his attorney, M.E. Morin, tried to argue at Nelson's March 1971 trial. The court, however, was disinclined to grant him that latitude, and he was found sane and guilty. Canada still had the death penalty at that time, but Nelson would be spared the punishment that many thought he deserved. He was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that would make him eligible for parole in 25 years, and if that were granted, Nelson would walk free in his mid-50s. How is that possible, Canada and America and wherever? This is ridiculous. And even though the prosecutors assured a fearful public that they had a plan for that eventually, Nelson had only been tried for 2 murders, Tracy Wasik and Kathy St Amand. Now, should he ever be paroled, he would be brought before the courts again to answer for the other 6 murders he committed. But in the end, none of that mattered, because Dale Nelson died of throat cancer in February 1999 while he was still incarcerated. All I can say is that I hope he suffered a lot. And I don't usually say that about the worst of the worst, but this guy was truly the devil incarnate. That wraps up episode 5 of Hell Month, and if you are liking it so far, then let me know and hit that like button right now. I appreciate you guys taking the time and watching these videos. It really means a lot. But I got nothing else for you today, so leave a comment, let me know what you think of this. I'm sorry it was so disturbing, but it was a story that just had to be told because it was gruesome, and we had to put this person on blast and be thankful for once that a monster was killed. Now, that's all I got for you today. Like I said, I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Cheers.